we've never had, I don't think, a summer where so many high-earning players are effectively in a form of bomb squad at their clubs at the moment. Most of the teams at the top of the table have got players who are going to have to go one way or the other. All of these players will have to go because there is no place for them in the squad. So I think it's multifaceted. The first thing you have to mention is the Club World Cup. So we had two teams that spent considerably in advance of that. Partly because they knew that they were getting some of the inflow of cash that was going to come from participating in that. And so around about £200 million will have come back to City and Chelsea in respect of the Club World Cup. And then, of course, that money also flowed into some of the other potential buyers of players from outside of the Premier League. Some of the Saudi teams, for example, Atletico Madrid, and these sorts of teams. So, and we know, of course, on top of that, Real Madrid even decided, for the sake of 2 or 3 games, to pay £10 million to take Alexander-Arnold early before the end of his contract. So, Club World Cup definitely was a factor. I think you've also got the flow through of some of the loosening around PSR. Now, we talk a lot about how that's affected the market throughout the summer in terms of clubs like Newcastle and Aston Villa in particular. But it's also true that because of some of the mechanisms that some clubs have been able to get around the PSR issues, I think they've spent relatively aggressively, and that might apply to a team like Nottingham Forest, for example. On top of that, some of the potential risk has been cleared up in terms of the UEFA sanctions. So when we discovered how UEFA was going to deal with the overspending at Chelsea and Aston Villa in terms of their settlement agreements, it crystallised what those numbers might be and how significant or not they might be. Now, we knew that the squad cost control was going to have certain penalties, but what we didn't know was what the penalties would be for the football earnings element. And it turns out that from the footballing earnings element, you're probably looking at something that's also quite manageable. So for Aston Villa, probably will end up being only €5 million over the next 3 years. And for Chelsea, a little bit more, €20 million. But again, they're unlikely to breach those again. And so the total exposure to the UEFA sanctions was relatively low. So if you've got all of those things out of the way as being key concerns, and you don't think you're going to breach PSR and suffer a points penalty, then you might be a bit more relaxed about spending money. You've then had a situation where clubs like Manchester United have found a way through their financial challenges, shall we say. Now, I think it's still not completely clear where the truth lay in terms of how bad the issue was in the first place in terms of cash, or how they fixed it. Now, it's probably that they've taken additional debt, and we'll learn about that over the next few weeks when they announce their results. But again, if you have a club that was probably expected to be a net seller, end up being quite a significant investor in the market, then clearly that's going to impact the total amount spent. And then you've got the knock-on. So if you have teams at the top of the table, the Liverpools, Manchester Cities, Manchester United, Chelsea, etc., spending very substantial sums very early on in the market, then those amounts are going to drip down through the market because obviously the teams who sell have got to replace. So there is a multiplying effect on spending, and I think that's what we're seeing. And I think we've got a long way to go. I think in the last few days of the window, a number of teams are very clearly going to have to spend significant amounts because they have both, they're going to be selling players, but also they've got a significant number of games. I mean, if you look at the European qualifiers, we now have a situation where 9 of the 17 surviving teams from last year, so more than half, are in European competition. And the likelihood is that most of those teams are going to have a minimum of 8 to 10 games. The Europa Conference is only 6 in the first phase, but it's very likely that Crystal Palace will qualify for the next phase. So they're very likely to have 8, 10, 12 additional fixtures next season and maybe more. They are going to need footballers. And then on top of that, they look likely to sell at least one player. Tottenham Hotspur are likely to have 10 Champions League games before the end of January. They again are likely to buy significant volume of player assets in the next few days. Teams like Fulham have been very quiet so far. And again, when you look at the spending that's occurred at the bottom end of the table, it is likely that they're going to have to react, and they're just waiting to see how the cards land from the spending of other teams that might open up some opportunities. So I think in all parts of the table, there's probably going to be substantial spending still to come. Well, these deals are going to have to happen. It's not really. A lot of them now are in a position where they're not optional. So most of the teams at the top of the table have got players who are going to have to go one way or the other. So Calvin Phillips will have to leave Manchester City either with a heavy subsidy or with a complete write-off of his contract by Manchester City. Likewise, Raheem Sterling at Chelsea and Ben Chilwell at Chelsea. Likewise, Jadon Sancho at Manchester United. All of these players will have to go because there is no place for them in the squad, and they're extremely expensive players. So the way these deals will be dealt with will be effectively by a subsidy. And the clubs who maybe at the start of the window would have hoped to have either sold the player or have received a loan fee plus a wage coverage, they're now going to be in a situation where they're looking for contributions to the cost of those players, be that as part of a very low fee that is discounted for the fact that the new club has to pay the wages of those players, or reduce loan fees, or contributions to the wages. Deals that will end up being similar to the deals that have been done previously for, let's say, Jadon Sancho when he went to Chelsea, or when Grealish went to Everton. So the bunch of players who have to be transferred are going to be transferred at cost to the selling club. Those players right now are liabilities on their books. They cost huge amounts of money in terms of wages, and from a PSR perspective, also have the PSR cost from an amortization perspective. So those players will have to go, and in the absence of teams being interested to pay what, in those cases, the players that we've talked about, and there are many others who are paid well in excess of £150,000 per week, those players are going to effectively have to be subsidised by the selling clubs, and that's going to create a rush to get those players out of the door. And you would think that the opportunistic clubs around teams like Fulham, West Ham United, perhaps Nottingham Forest, perhaps some of the relegated teams, they may look at these as opportunities to acquire players that ordinarily they couldn't afford, because they're effectively going to end up being subsidised by the selling club. But there's no way around that. We've never had, I don't think, a summer where so many high-earning players are effectively in a form of bomb squad at their clubs at the moment, with no real interest. So the clubs are out there with the media trying to drum up media interest and suggesting media interest. But the reality is that most of the buying clubs are sitting tight, knowing that as we get closer to the 1st of September, the selling clubs are going to know that they're going to have to subsidise heavily and more heavily as we get to the 1st of September. So that's the game that's going on at the moment. But the cost of those players is really quite extraordinary on any historical look. I don't think that we've had this number of players earning this amount of money so clearly out of favour at their current clubs. Largely because at the moment there is only really one league in Europe that is performing from a commercial, from a broadcast and from a financial perspective. If you were to go through the top leagues other than the Premier League, each of them has their own story of a level of distress and diminishing revenues in certain aspects. Now, that's not to say that the Premier League, everything is rosy in the Premier League, because in many ways it isn't. Sponsorship is becoming more challenging. The media rights has maintained at the same headline level, but they've done so by selling many more games on the domestic package. But that said, it's clearly the dominant world league right now, and that means that they have more ability to spend big in the transfer market, and the European clubs know that they can get the best prices from the Premier League. And so everybody is effectively, and this goes from the start of the window to where we are now, everybody is waiting to see which Premier League clubs pick off players from the European game, be that France, Germany, to a lesser extent Italy, and Portugal. And so that process, I think, has been there for quite some time. I think it's been particularly strong this season with Germany. A number of players have moved for over £50 million from Germany to the Premier League, including in January with Marmoush to Manchester City, and the Verts, of course, to Liverpool. So that has been a huge inflow into the German market. They've been much more cautious in terms of their spending. So it's been surprising, perhaps, that there hasn't been a huge flow of that German money coming back into the Premier League. There's been selective opportunities. Kwanzaa, for example, Bayer Leverkusen have also taken a loan player from Manchester City. But for a lot of the rumour, players like McAtee were looked at by the German clubs, but ultimately those deals didn't happen. So there's been a drip down from the Premier League into the European markets. They've then spread and replaced those players with purchases from France, Germany, Portugal, Spain. And so we are getting to a situation where the European market as a whole, aside from one or two exceptions, and clearly PSG, Bayern Munich, Real Madrid and Barcelona and Atletico Madrid, clearly they're exceptions given their scale. But aside from that, a lot of the rest of the market is effectively an incubator for future Premier League signings at big money, and at money that's above what they could receive from all but, a group of maybe 5 non-Premier League clubs. So I think that trend is again likely to continue, and possibly when you look at the French situation with the TV deal and the issues that they've got from the media rights, it's very likely that the French league becomes even more of an incubator for the Premier League, even more than it is now, which would be, it's already a very substantial market for the Premier League, and you can see it getting even more so going forward. Well, I guess we'll have to see if it works. We know Ipswich spent substantial amounts last season, but we're probably coming off a lower base than Sunderland. Clearly, if you can stay in the Premier League for 2-3 years, you can obviously generate that Premier League money, but you also guarantee yourself parachute money for longer. And so you just start to build a situation where you're part of, at worst, a yo-yo situation. Because if you've got the parachute payment, upon relegation, you are that much more likely to get promotion in that first year back. And so if you can yo-yo between the divisions for a substantial period, and if you've structured your wages in particular well, such that there's relegation clauses within those contracts. Burnley's a great example of a club that did that, and so when you look at the numbers upon relegation, yes, their revenue drops, but their costs reduce to a level which means that with the parachute payment, they're actually not in a net worse position than they would be as a Premier League team. And if you can do that for 2 or 3 cycles, then you've got more chance of establishing yourself in the Premier League. And of course, even better, if you can somehow do what Nottingham Forest did, PSR issues aside, but if you can effectively take yourself from a club who has been in the lower divisions for some time and establish yourself as a Premier League club, and even a Premier League club that might get European football, might even get Champions League football, clearly that's going to be transformational to your numbers and to your financials. And again, as long as you've got your cost base appropriately provisoed for relegation, then it can be, you can have great success. The issue that some of these clubs and the challenge that some of these clubs will have is very similar to the Leicester situation, where if you fly very close to the top for a sustained period, you can end up getting quite complacent with how you structure some of your wages, and you start to have more players without relegation clauses, and you start to get in a position where if relegation happens unexpectedly, it's very difficult for you to deal with the consequences of that if you get relegated. And that's something that a team like Nottingham Forest will be mindful of, I would think, in terms of getting that balance between being successful, dealing with a high number of additional games in Europe, but also making sure that they don't fall into a relegation issue and give themselves a cost-based issue, which would undermine everything, because it would give you the PSR issues, both in the Premier League and potentially in the EFL. And then you have the knock-on effect of that, because you get points deductions, and that therefore makes it harder to get promotion, even if you've got a higher cost base. It's all very, very similar to the situation and the challenges that Leicester have right now. And you end up having to sell your best players for probably less than you would ordinarily like to.